Picture a knight in shining armor, gleaming under the sun, a figure of pure power and legend, but have you ever stopped to wonder what it truly felt like inside all that steel? When we see these warriors in films or museums, it's easy to imagine them as almost superhuman, encased in metal, but the reality is far more human and far more fascinating. What did they wear underneath that imposing suit of armor? It's one of those quiet questions that linger in the back of your mind, something you might have pondered during an epic battle scene. And today, we're going to uncover the surprising, intimate truth. This isn't just about fabric or fashion. It's about survival, mobility, and the gritty, real experience of being a warrior 700 years ago. Think about the weight, layer upon layer of hammered iron and steel, heavy enough to crush the unprepared, hot enough to feel like an oven under the summer sun. Now imagine moving in it, fighting for your life, with every swing of a sword or impact of an arrow reverberating through your body. What kept these knights from being bruised, exhausted, or utterly immobilized within minutes? The answer lies in what was hidden beneath the metal. A system of clothing and padding so cleverly designed, it was the difference between life and death on the battlefield. This was their second skin, their shield against the very armor meant to protect them. And it tells a story of innovation born from necessity. Join me as we step beyond the gleaming surface and into the world of the medieval knight, not as a distant legend, but as a living, breathing person who relied on every thread and strap to stay alive. We'll explore how these layers work together, what materials they used, and why getting it wrong could mean disaster. This journey is about rediscovering the human side of history, the problem-solving and care that went into every detail of a warrior's life. By the end of this video, you'll not only know what knights wore under their armor, you'll understand the brilliant, often overlooked engineering that turned a suit of metal into a mobile fortress, and the people who wore it into legends. So before any of the specialized padding even came into play, the knight started with the same basic item that nearly every medieval person, from the lowest farmer to the highest noble, would have worn every single day: a simple linen undertunic. This wasn't some high-tech piece of military gear. It was essentially medieval underwear, the absolute foundation of getting dressed. But for a man about to be sealed inside a metal shell, this humble garment took on a critical, life-saving importance. Its primary job was managing moisture. A full day of combat, or even just a long march under the summer sun while wearing armor, would generate an immense amount of sweat. Linen, woven from the fibers of the flax plant, is a remarkably breathable fabric. It pulls that moisture away from the skin and allows it to evaporate much more efficiently than something like wool. This was vital for preventing skin irritation and rashes that could become debilitating over a long campaign. But it was also about basic body temperature regulation. Staying relatively dry meant staying relatively cool, which in turn meant staving off heat exhaustion and maintaining the stamina needed to fight. The second crucial function was creating a physical barrier. Even the most expertly crafted steel armor has edges, rivets, and interior surfaces that are nowhere near as smooth as the polished exterior. Without a layer of fabric between that metal and the skin, every movement would be an exercise in constant, grating abrasion. A simple linen tunic, with its smooth texture, prevented the metal from rubbing the knight's skin raw within minutes. It acted as an essential buffer, turning what would have been a torturous experience into something merely incredibly uncomfortable. Now, while the style of this garment was universal, its quality was anything but. A wealthy knight or nobleman would have worn an undertunic made of fine, soft, tightly woven linen, perhaps even bleached to a light color. It would have been cut to fit well, reducing excess fabric that could bunch up and cause hot spots under the armor. For a poorer man-at-arms or a conscripted soldier, the reality was far different. His tunic might be made of coarse, scratchy, loosely woven linen, or even a blend of linen and rough hemp. It might be ill-fitting, patched, and far less effective at its job. This simple difference in underwear could genuinely impact a fighter's comfort, focus, and ultimately, his effectiveness on the battlefield. It's a powerful reminder that even in the details of what they wore, the medieval world was sharply divided by class and wealth. But that linen tunic was only the beginning. While it protected the knight's torso, his lower body required its own specialized foundation, a system of garments that might seem surprisingly familiar to us today. We often picture knights in full-body metal, but they weren't just hopping into leg plates over their bare skin. Underneath it all, they wore what amounted to medieval underwear, a practical, two-part ensemble consisting of braies and chausses. Let's start with the braies. Imagine a pair of loose, baggy linen shorts, tied securely around the waist with a long drawstring. This was the universal undergarment for men from all walks of medieval life. For a knight, the functionality of these simple drawers was paramount. Their loose, breezy design was a godsend for ventilation in an otherwise stiflingly hot suit of armor. But more importantly, it allowed for complete freedom of movement through the hips and thighs. Whether mounting a massive warhorse, swinging a leg over a saddle, or adopting a wide, stable fighting stance, the braies moved with the wearer without any constriction. They were the absolute baseline of comfort and practicality. Now, while the braies covered the core of the lower body, the legs themselves were protected by a separate item, chausses. These were essentially individual stockings or leggings, each one pulled on over a leg independently. Early chausses were often made of wool and might only extend to the knee, but as leg armor evolved to fully encase the limb from hip to foot, so too did these undergarments. For a knight, his chausses would be made of sturdier, often quilted linen or even wool, providing that essential padded buffer between his skin and the solid metal greaves and cuisses that would be strapped on top. But this created a new challenge. How do you keep these long stockings from simply falling down, especially during the violent motion of combat? The ingenious solution was a system of ties called points. Small, reinforced holes would be sewn into the upper edges of the chausses. Matching holes were worked into the lower edge of the braies, or onto a separate leather belt worn under the tunic. Then the knight would take thin leather laces or cords and literally point, or tie, his chausses to his underpants or belt. This might sound comical to our modern ears, tying your socks to your underwear, but it was a brilliantly effective and simple piece of engineering. It kept everything perfectly in place, ensuring that no matter how hard he fought or rode, his protective layers remained exactly where they were supposed to be, preventing painful slippage, chafing, or bunched up fabric that could cause a dangerous distraction in the heat of battle. This entire system, from the breathable braies to the securely pointed chausses, was a testament to medieval practicality, solving very human problems with clever, straightforward design. So while the linen layer managed moisture and the braies and chausses formed a stable foundation, the single most critical piece of under-armor gear was the gambeson. This was the workhorse of medieval personal protection, a garment so versatile and vital that many soldiers who couldn't afford metal plate wore it as their primary and only armor. Often called an aketon, from the Arabic word al-qutan meaning cotton, this wasn't just a simple padded vest. It was a masterpiece of textile engineering, a thick, heavily quilted jacket that could be worn on its own or as the essential buffer between a knight's body and his cold, hard steel shell. The secret to its effectiveness lay in its construction. Tailors would take 2 layers of sturdy linen or wool canvas and sandwich a filling of raw wool, linen tow, which is the short, coarse fibers left over from processing flax, or even scraps of old cloth. This sandwich was then stitched together with thousands of meticulous stitches, creating dense, vertical channels that ran the entire length of the garment. This quilting was absolutely crucial. It wasn't just decorative, it served the vital function of locking the stuffing firmly in place. Without these stitched channels, the filling would slide down to the bottom of the jacket after a few minutes of vigorous movement, leaving the knight's chest and back vulnerable while creating an uncomfortably bulky mess around his waist. The intricate diamond, lozenge, or vertical strip patterns seen in historical illustrations were all functional solutions to this very practical problem, ensuring the protection remained even and consistent. And that protection was remarkably formidable. Tests with replicas and accounts from the period show that a well-made gambeson was far more than just soft padding. The layers of stuffed, quilted fabric were incredibly effective at absorbing and dispersing the energy from a blow. It could stop arrows, especially at longer ranges, and significantly blunt the impact of swords, axes, and maces. While it might not prevent a bone from breaking under the full force of a poleaxe, it could turn a lethal strike into a survivable injury. The padding worked by catching weapon points in its dense, fibrous layers, snagging and slowing them down long before they could reach the skin. For a knight in full plate, the gambeson added an indispensable extra layer of shock absorption, preventing the metal plates from being driven into his body upon impact and mitigating the concussive force that would otherwise travel straight through the armor. It was the difference between a ringing clang that left a bruise and a devastating blow that could incapacitate a warrior entirely. Creating a truly effective gambeson was a specialized craft, demanding skills that sat somewhere between a tailor and an armorer. The process began not with expensive materials, but with choosing the right ones for each specific purpose. The outer layers, taking the brunt of the wear and tear, were typically made from a tightly woven, sturdy linen canvas. This fabric was chosen for its strength and its ability to resist fraying, which was crucial when thousands of stitches would be punched through it. For the inner lining, something softer might be used to provide a more comfortable feel against the undertunic, though durability was still the priority. The true heart of the gambeson, however, was its stuffing, and here the choices revealed a clear hierarchy of wealth and protection. For the average soldier or a knight of modest means, the filling was a practical affair. They might use linen tow, the short, coarse fibers left over from processing flax, or even chopped up scraps of old cloth and rags. This provided decent padding at a low cost, but it could be lumpy and might compact unevenly over time. A step up from this was raw, carded wool. Wool fibers are naturally springy and resilient, offering superior shock absorption and better insulation against both impact and cold. A gambeson stuffed with wool was a significant upgrade in comfort and protective quality. But for the elite, for the wealthiest knights and nobles who spared no expense on their martial equipment, there was a premium option: horsehair. This might seem like a strange choice, but it was the high-performance material of its day. Horsehair, particularly from the tail and mane, is incredibly tough, resilient, and springy. A gambeson stuffed with horsehair was lighter and more flexible than one packed with wool or linen, yet it offered even better protection. The long, stiff hairs would catch and snag weapon points with incredible efficiency, and the stuffing would spring back into shape after a blow, maintaining its protective integrity far longer than other materials would. The rustling sound of moving in a horsehair gambeson must have been a distinct auditory marker of high status on the battlefield. Regardless of the stuffing, the magic and the immense labor, was in the quilting. This wasn't a task for an apprentice. It required a skilled hand and immense patience. Using a heavy needle and strong thread, the tailor would meticulously sew through all the layers, top fabric, stuffing, and bottom fabric, creating those dense, closely spaced channels. The pattern of this quilting wasn't just for show. Each style had a tactical purpose. Vertical stripes helped the stuffing settle naturally and were slightly easier to construct. Diamond or lozenge patterns, often seen on higher quality examples, were superior. This diamond grid created a honeycomb-like structure that locked the stuffing in place even more effectively, preventing any shift and ensuring the padding remained uniformly thick across the entire garment. Every single one of these thousands of stitches was a potential weak point if done poorly. A place where the thread could snap under stress and create a seam for a blade to find. The quality of this hand quilting was a direct testament to the armorer's skill, and the final product was a direct indicator of the wearer's place in the world. You could read a knight's wealth and status simply by looking at his padded jacket. A poor man's gambeson might be barely more than 1/4 of an inch thick, sparsely quilted, and stuffed with questionable materials. A knight's gambeson, however, could be a daunting 2 inches thick or more, a monstrously padded garment that was hot and cumbersome, but could save his life. The wealthiest lords might own several gambesons for different purposes. A lighter, more flexible one for foot combat or warm weather, and an incredibly thick, almost mattress-like one for wearing under full plate armor in a tournament, where the primary threat was brutal, concussive blows from lances and war hammers. The construction of this humble padded jacket, therefore, was a perfect microcosm of medieval society itself, a visible, tangible representation of class, wealth, and the relentless pursuit of survival. But as plate armor technology reached its peak in the late 14th and 15th centuries, becoming more form-fitting and articulated than ever before, the basic gambeson began to show its limitations. A thick, all-purpose padded jacket was simply too bulky and inflexible to wear under such precision-engineered steel. Knights and their armorers needed a more sophisticated solution, a dedicated undergarment designed from the ground up to work in perfect harmony with plate armor. This innovation was the arming doublet, and it was the closest thing the medieval world had to a piece of high-tech wearable gear. This was no longer just padded clothing. It was a purpose-built foundation layer, the central nervous system of a full suit of plate. Unlike the voluminous gambeson, the arming doublet was tailored to fit the wearer's torso as snugly as a modern athletic jacket. It was typically crafted from layers of stout linen, or a linen-wool blend called fustian, offering durability without excessive weight. The padding was strategic and selective. Instead of being uniformly thick all over, it was heavily quilted only in key areas of high impact and wear, across the shoulders, under the arms, and around the torso where the edges of the breastplate would rest. This provided crucial cushioning exactly where it was needed while allowing for far greater freedom of movement everywhere else. The doublet's true genius, however, was not in its padding but in its points. Sewn directly onto the fabric of the doublet was a network of leather laces, each one ending in a reinforced metal tip called an aglet. These weren't randomly placed. Their positions were meticulously planned to correspond with the attachment points on every major piece of the knight's armor. There were points at the shoulders to lace on the rerebraces and shoulder cops, points at the elbows for the vambraces, points around the waist for the leg harness, and even points to secure the mail gussets that protected the armpits. This system transformed the knight from a man wearing separate pieces of equipment into a single integrated fighting unit. Each piece of steel was tied directly to this sturdy foundation, hanging from it and moving with it, rather than being strapped haphazardly to the body or to other plates. This distributed the immense weight of the armor far more efficiently across the entire body, making it feel significantly lighter and more responsive. Dressing for battle became a precise, multi-step ritual centered entirely on this garment. The knight would first put on his linen underclothes, then step into the arming doublet, lacing it up the front. An assistant, often his squire, would then methodically begin attaching the armor, starting with the leg harnesses and working upward. Each piece was tied firmly to its designated point, the aiglettes making it easy to thread the laces through the metal loops. This point system was so secure and effective that a knight could theoretically be picked up by his arming doublet, and his entire suit of armor would hang from him, perfectly in place. It was a masterpiece of functional design, turning what could have been a clumsy assortment of metal plates into a second skin of steel, all orchestrated by the humble threads of a tailored jacket. This entire intricate suit of steel, from the greaves on the shins to the vambraces on the forearms, was suspended from the arming doublet by an ingenious and surprisingly simple network, a web of leather laces and reinforced holes known as the point system. Think of it not as straps holding the armor on, but as a structural exoskeleton where the fabric doublet was the central anchor from which everything else hung. Each major piece of armor had its own designated attachment point. Along the edges of the steel plates, armorers would carefully drill small, reinforced holes called arming points. These weren't crude punctures. They were often reinforced with brass or latten rings to prevent the leather from fraying and to provide a smooth surface for the lace to pull against. The other half of this partnership was on the doublet itself, sewn directly onto the sturdy linen in exactly the right locations were the leather laces themselves. Each one was tipped with a metal aiglet, a small hardened tip that functioned like the end of a modern shoelace, making it easy to thread through the corresponding hole in the armor. The placement was a masterclass in ergonomic design. Points at the shoulders connected to the upper arm defenses. Points at the elbows secured the lower arm pieces. A series of points around the waistline of the doublet were crucial for attaching the heavy leg harness, the cuisses for the thighs, the polins for the knees, and the greaves for the shins. This method of suspension was revolutionary. Instead of the weight of the legs being borne by the hips alone, it was distributed up through the torso via the doublet, making the immense load feel significantly lighter and more balanced. The process of putting it all on, known as arming the knight, was a precise and time-consuming ritual that absolutely required at least one assistant, almost always a squire or a trained servant. It was a two-person job from start to finish. The knight would first don his soft layers, the linen underclothes, and his chausses before stepping into the arming doublet and lacing it up the front. Then the real work began. The squire would start from the feet and work upward, methodically tying each piece of plate armor to its specific point on the doublet. This wasn't a quick process. It could take 15 to 30 minutes for an experienced team to fully arm a knight, a period of focused concentration and practiced routine. The squire had to ensure every lace was pulled taut and tied with a secure, double-knotted bow that could be quickly undone if necessary, but would not accidentally come loose during the violent chaos of combat. This reliance on a network of leather cords, however, introduced a critical vulnerability. A single broken point in the heat of battle could be catastrophic. Imagine a knight in a fierce melee, swinging his sword, when the point securing his left vambrace suddenly snaps. The steel plate on his forearm would immediately go slack, sliding down and hampering his ability to wield his weapon or raise his shield effectively. Even worse, If a point holding a leg harness failed, the heavy steel cuisse and greave could suddenly twist around his leg or even slide down to his ankle, tripping him up at the most crucial moment. On a chaotic battlefield, falling over could mean being trampled by horses or quickly overwhelmed by enemy soldiers. For this reason, a knight's kit would often include a small purse or pouch containing spare leather laces and pre-threaded needles, a medieval equivalent of a field repair kit. The integrity of each of those seemingly insignificant leather ties was, quite literally, a matter of life and death, a constant reminder that the entire formidable shell of steel depended on the strength of a few carefully placed threads. But of course, the knight's body wasn't the only part that needed safeguarding. His head was the most critical target, and protecting it required its own specialized set of under-armor innovations. The experience of wearing a great helm or a close-fitting bassinet was about far more than just slipping a metal bucket over one's head. It was an exercise in managing claustrophobia, impact, and even personal identity, all solved with a few clever pieces of cloth and padding. First and foremost came the arming cap. This was a simple yet vital piece of headwear, typically a close-fitting linen or soft wool cap that was worn directly on the head. Its primary job was twofold: comfort and hygiene. The interior of any helmet, no matter how well polished, is a landscape of rough edges, rivet heads, and sharp burrs. The arming cap provided an essential barrier that prevented these from scraping and irritating the scalp and forehead. Just as importantly, it soaked up sweat, stopping it from running into the knight's eyes during combat, and helping to keep the interior of his expensive steel helmet free from moisture that could lead to rust and corrosion. For a wealthy knight, this cap might be lightly padded with wool for extra comfort, but its purpose was always fundamentally practical. For those wearing the larger great helms of the 12th and 13th centuries, or the more enclosed bassinets with attached visors in the 14th and 15th centuries, a second, more specialized layer was often added, the padded coif or arming liner. This was a heavily padded version of the mail coif, but made from quilted fabric instead of metal rings. It was stitched directly to the inside of the helmet itself, creating a custom-fitted suspension system. This liner was the true shock absorber for the head. A sword blow to the helmet would transfer its energy into this thick, padded layer, which would compress and disperse the force across a wider area of the skull, dramatically reducing the chance of a concussion or skull fracture. The difference between wearing a helmet with a good liner and without one was the difference between a ringing in your ears and being knocked unconscious. Beyond the physics of protection, these layers address the profound psychological challenge of the helmet: sensory deprivation. Once the visor was closed, a knight's world shrunk dramatically. His field of vision was reduced to a few narrow slits. His hearing became muffled and distorted by the enclosing metal, and his own breathing became loud and echoey inside the helm. The padding of the arming cap and liner helped to dampen some of the metallic echoes and the jarring ring of impacts, making the acoustic environment slightly less disorienting. But perhaps the most isolating factor was the loss of identity. Encased in steel, a knight became an anonymous, fearsome instrument of war. The soft layers next to his skin were his last tangible connection to his own self, a small private comfort in a world of overwhelming noise, heat, and violence. This careful attention to the head's protection highlights a sophisticated understanding that true readiness for battle involved preparing the mind for the ordeal as much as it did armoring the body. While the padded layers protected against impact and the arming doublet provided a solid foundation, there was one area of the body that remained uniquely vulnerable to a slashing or piercing attack: the neck, the sides of the head, and the shoulders. A sword blade could easily slide up under the rim of a breastplate, or find the gap between a helmet and the shoulder defenses. To seal this critical gap in their defenses, knights relied on a masterpiece of metalwork, the mail coif. Pronounced coif. This was a hood constructed entirely from thousands of interlocked iron rings, a flexible curtain of metal that protected everything the solid plates could not. The construction of a mail coif was a testament to both patience and craftsmanship. A mail maker or armorer would begin by drawing iron wire through a steel drawplate to achieve a uniform thickness. This wire was then coiled around a rod and cut into individual rings. Each ring was then riveted closed with a tiny hammer and anvil, a process repeated thousands of times to create a sheet of fabric-like metal. For the coif, this sheet was expertly shaped into a hood pattern, with a hole left for the face and sometimes a flap, called a ventail or chainmail, that could be drawn across the lower face and secured with a leather strap for extra protection. When worn, it draped over the head and shoulders, extending down to the collarbones and sometimes further, shielding the neck, throat, and the upper spine, all prime targets in combat. How it was worn evolved alongside helmet design. In the 12th and 13th centuries, when knights wore the imposing great helm, a massive cylinder of steel with only small sight and breathing holes, the mail coif was an independent piece of armor worn underneath. The knight would first put on his arming cap for comfort, then pull the heavy mail hood over it, settling the weight on his shoulders. The great helm was then placed on top, resting on the mail-covered shoulders. This layered system meant that even if a weapon point found its way through one of the helm's vision slits, it would still have to penetrate the dense mail beneath. As helmet design advanced into the 14th century with the development of the bassinets, a more form-fitting, conical steel cap, the mail coif underwent a brilliant integration. Instead of being a separate hood, the mail was often permanently attached to the helmet itself. A row of holes would be drilled around the base of the bassinet, and a mail curtain, now called an aventail or chainmail, would be riveted directly to the helmet's edge. This created a seamless transition from the solid steel skull protection to the flexible mail defense for the neck and shoulders. This was not only more convenient, as it was one less piece to put on, but it also provided superior protection with fewer gaps for an enemy to exploit. The weight of the mail was now borne by the helmet, which in turn was stabilized by the padded arming cap underneath, creating a much more balanced and comfortable system for the wearer. For some knights, especially in the earlier periods, the coif wasn't a separate item at all, but was integrated into a larger garment known as a hauberk. The hauberk was a long shirt of mail that could extend to the knees or even the mid-calf, with long sleeves that ended in mail mittens. In many of these, the coif was simply part of the shirt, a hood that was attached to the body of the hauberk at the shoulders. When the knight put on his mail shirt, he was simultaneously putting on his neck and head protection. This design offered incredible coverage with no gap at all between the hood and the torso. But it also concentrated a tremendous amount of weight, up to 30 pounds or more on the shoulders. It was a trade-off between ultimate security and the sheer physical burden of carrying that much iron all day. Whether separate or integrated, the mail coif was an indispensable part of the knight's defensive ensemble. A shimmering, intricate web of steel that turned the most vulnerable targets into some of the best protected parts of his body. Moving downward, the knight's legs required a sophisticated and layered defense, a system where flexible mail and rigid plate worked in perfect concert, all suspended from the foundation of his arming doublet. Protecting the legs was absolutely critical. A debilitating wound to a thigh or shin would instantly end a knight's ability to fight or even stand, making him an easy target on the battlefield. The solution was a carefully engineered combination of mail and plate, each piece relying on the garments beneath for both comfort and security. The first line of defense for the lower limbs was a pair of mail chausses. These were essentially stockings made entirely of interlocked iron rings, designed to protect the legs from the knee down to the foot. Putting them on was a precise process. The knight would first have his braies and any separate linen leggings in place. Then each mail chausse was pulled on individually, much like a very heavy, flexible sock. The foot of the chausse was often shaped like a modern footy sock, with a separate toe area. And some versions even included a leather sole sewn into the mail to protect the bottom of the foot from abrasion, and to provide a bit of grip inside the shoe or sabaton. To keep these metal stockings from sagging or twisting around the leg, a major hazard during movement, they were secured using the same points system used for the arming doublet. Leather laces sewn to the top edge of the mail chausse were tied to corresponding points on the lower edge of the braies, or to a special belt worn underneath the gambeson or doublet. This kept the mail taut and perfectly positioned, ensuring it wouldn't bunch up at the ankle or knee when the plate armor was strapped on top. Over this flexible mail layer came the hard plate armor for the legs, known as the leg harness. This was a multi-part assembly. For the thighs, there were the quilted. These were curved steel plates that protected the front and sides of the upper leg. Early quilted were often made from boiled leather, but by the height of plate armor, they were almost always steel. To prevent the hard metal from grinding directly against the mail and the leg beneath, the inside of the quiz was frequently lined with a small quilted pad, tied in place or riveted to the metal. This tiny bit of padding was crucial for comfort and to absorb the shock of any impact. Protecting the knee was one of the most complex challenges for armorers, given the joint's essential range of motion. The answer was the polin, a domed steel plate that covered the kneecap, often featuring a prominent, flanged extension that wrapped around the sides of the knee to deflect blows. The genius of the polin was its articulation. It was not fixed rigidly to the quiz above or the greave below. Instead, it was attached using internal leather straps and sliding rivets, allowing it to pivot smoothly as the knight bent his knee. This early form of articulated joint was a marvel of medieval engineering, granting near complete mobility while maintaining unwavering protection. Many polins also included small, fan-like plates, called lames above and below the main plate to guard the vulnerable areas at the top of the shin and the back of the knee, creating a flexible skirt of steel around the joint. Below the knee, the shins were encased in greaves. These were two curved plates that wrapped around the front of the leg, meeting at the back and secured with buckles or straps. Their shape was expertly crafted to deflect blows away from the body. Like the quilted, they were often worn over the mail chausses, completing the layered defense of the lower leg. Finally, the feet were protected by sabatons, incredibly intricate steel shoes made from overlapping lames that mimicked the articulation of the foot's bones, allowing the knight to walk and even run without a clumsy, clanking gait. The entire weight of this formidable leg harness, the quilted, polins, greaves, and sabatons, was not borne by the knight's hips or legs themselves. That would have been exhausting and restrictive. Instead, the entire assembly was suspended from the waist. A sturdy leather belt, either integrated into the arming doublet or a separate item called a girdle, ran around the knight's torso. From this belt hung a series of leather straps called points. The top of each quiz had a metal loop or a reinforced leather tab. The knight or his squire would tie the straps from the belt directly to these attachment points on the quilted. This brilliant method of suspension transferred the immense weight of the steel legs from the knight's limbs to his core, his strongest anatomical center. It distributed the load evenly across his hips and abdomen. making the armor feel surprisingly light and allowing for a much greater freedom of movement. A knight could mount his horse, run, kneel, and adopt powerful fighting stances because his legs were not carrying the weight. His torso was. This system of suspension was the final critical link that transformed the theory of full-plate armor into a practical, wearable reality. Now, one of the most persistent myths about knights is that they were essentially mobile ovens, constantly on the verge of heat stroke inside their metal shells. We picture them fainting in the sun during a crusade or steaming like a baked potato during a summer campaign. But this modern assumption misses the brilliant, practical reality of their layered system, which was surprisingly effective at managing temperature. It wasn't about preventing heat. That was inevitable with exertion. It was about managing moisture and airflow in a way that kept the body functional and as comfortable as possible under extreme conditions. The first and most crucial layer in this climate control system was the humble linen undertunic. As we discussed, linen is a superstar when it comes to wicking moisture. As the knight's body heated up, the fabric would pull sweat away from his skin and spread it across a larger surface area, where it could then evaporate. This process of evaporation is a powerful cooling mechanism. By keeping the skin relatively dry, the linen layer prevented the clammy, suffocating feeling of being trapped in wet fabric, which is a primary cause of discomfort and rapid overheating. It was the foundational piece of personal air conditioning. Next, the gambeson or padded arming doublet played a counterintuitive but vital role. It acted as a thermal buffer. We often think of insulation as something that only keeps heat in, like a winter coat, but its true function is to regulate the transfer of temperature. The thick quilted gambeson created a layer of trapped air between the knight's body and the outside world. In cold weather, this air warmed by body heat and kept him warm. In hot weather, this same principle worked in reverse. It prevented the external heat from the sun-baked metal armor from immediately conducting inward and roasting the wearer. The armor itself could become scorching hot to the touch under direct sunlight, but that quilted barrier gave the knight precious time before that heat reached his skin. Furthermore, the natural fibers of the stuffing, whether wool or linen, are breathable. They allowed for a slow, diffused exchange of air and moisture vapor, preventing a buildup of stifling humidity right against the body. And then there was the armor itself. Full plate armor was not a solid, sealed sarcophagus. It was a highly articulated suit with countless gaps and openings that were necessary for movement. And these same gaps served as ventilation channels. Air could flow under the skirt of the fold, around the armholes, and through the gaps at the joints. This created a chimney effect, where hot air rising from the body could escape out the top, drawing cooler air in from the bottom. A knight walking or riding was constantly generating a slight breeze through his suit. This is a stark contrast to modern military body armor, which is often made of solid, non-breathable synthetic plates and thick, waterproof canvas carriers. A modern soldier wearing such gear can indeed suffer terribly from heat retention. As there's no natural airflow, the sweat has nowhere to go, and the body cannot cool itself effectively. When you combine all these elements, the moisture-wicking linen, the insulating and breathable gambeson, and the ventilated steel shell, you get a system that was remarkably advanced for its time. A knight in full plate during a summer battle was undoubtedly hot and working hard, but his clothing was working with his body's physiology to manage that heat. He was likely far more comfortable and less prone to crippling heat exhaustion than a Roman legionary wearing heavy woolen cloaks and leather, or a 19th century soldier in a thick wool uniform. The medieval armorer's solution wasn't to fight physics, but to harness it, creating a microclimate around the warrior that was the product of centuries of practical, life-or-death experimentation. This brings us to one of the most stubborn and enduring myths about medieval knights: the idea that they were clumsy, slow-moving tanks, utterly dependent on a crane to get onto their horse and completely helpless if they ever fell over. It's an image popularized by films and cartoons, but it couldn't be further from the truth. A knight in a properly fitted suit of plate armor was not a prisoner inside a metal can. He was an athlete encased in a custom-engineered exoskeleton. The secret to this incredible mobility wasn't magic. It was physics, brilliant craftsmanship, and that foundational arming doublet doing its job perfectly. Think about how weight is carried. A modern backpacker knows that a 50-pound load feels unbearable if carried in their arms, but perfectly manageable when strapped securely to their back and hips with a well-designed frame. Plate armor worked on the exact same principle. The entire suit, which could weigh between 45 and 60 pounds, was not simply hung from the shoulders. That would have been crippling. Instead, its weight was strategically distributed across the entire body. The leg harness was suspended from the waist belt, transferring the weight of the steel greaves, polins, and cuisses to the knight's core and hips, the strongest part of the body. The weight of the arms was borne by the points on the shoulders and elbows of the arming doublet. The breastplate rested on the torso, its weight spread across the ribcage. No single part of the body was carrying a disproportionate load. This even distribution is why trained knights could move with an agility that seems unbelievable to our modern eyes. 60 pounds sounds heavy until you realize it's less than the full gear a modern firefighter or a special forces soldier carries into action. And their equipment is often far less balanced. The proof of this mobility is found in the historical record itself. Fetched butcher or fencing manuals from the 15th century are filled with intricate illustrations and instructions showing armored men performing astounding feats of gymnastics. They depict knights scaling wooden ladders placed against a castle wall using only their hands, performing forward rolls and somersaults in full harness, and even vaulting into the saddle of their horse without any assistance. These weren't just theoretical exercises. They were practical drills for the battlefield. The ability to quickly mount a horse without a squire's help could save a knight's life in the chaos of a melee. The capacity to regain his feet rapidly after being knocked down was absolutely essential. If a knight fell, he was not a stranded turtle. He could use the weight and rigidity of his own armor to leverage himself back up, often by rolling onto his front, getting into a kneeling position, and using his strength to stand. This is where the articulation of the armor truly shone. A master armorer was a sculptor who understood human biomechanics intimately. Every joint was a complex system of overlapping steel plates, called lames, connected by internal leather straps and sliding rivets that allowed for a near full range of motion. The knight's cuirass was flared at the hips, so he could bend at the waist. His sabatons were made of overlapping scales that flexed with his feet. His gauntlets had individually articulating finger plates that allowed him to grasp a rein, a sword hilt, or a dagger with precision. The entire suit moved with him, not against him. Modern reenactors wearing accurate reproductions of this armor regularly demonstrate these capabilities, running obstacle courses, doing push-ups, and engaging in full contact sparring. The sound is not a clumsy clanking, but a smooth metallic rustling, a testament to thousands of perfectly fitted parts working in harmony. The myth of the immobile knight is finally being put to rest, not by words, but by the sight of a person in full plate performing a perfect cartwheel. Even with the most perfectly distributed weight and brilliantly articulated joints, a knight's daily reality was one of constant, grinding friction. No amount of masterful tailoring could completely eliminate the simple, brutal physics of metal plates, sliding against each other and moving against the body. For all its engineering marvels, a suit of armor was still an incredibly demanding thing to wear, and managing the inevitable wear and tear on the body was a fundamental part of a warrior's life. The areas of greatest concern were the body's natural friction points. The armpits were a prime hotspot, a complex junction where the movements of the arms, shoulders, and torso plates all converge. Without proper protection, the edges of the spaulders and braies would have soared directly into the soft skin with every swing of a sword or shield. The inner thighs were another critical zone, where the motion of walking or riding would bring the hard, medial edges of the cuisses into constant contact with each other and the body. The neck was perpetually vulnerable, where the rigid edge of the gorget met the skin, and even the wrists and elbows, despite their articulation, were susceptible to rubbing from the constant flexion and extension of combat. This is where the strategic design of the underlayers proved its worth beyond mere shock absorption. The gambeson and arming doublet weren't just uniformly thick, they were often deliberately reinforced and more heavily padded in these exact high-friction areas. A doublet would feature extra quilting across the shoulders and under the arms, creating a raised, cushioned berm that lifted the primary weight of the shoulder armor off the bony crest of the shoulder itself and placed it on the thicker muscle of the upper arm and back. The padding in the armpit was specifically shaped to fill the hollow space, preventing the armor from bottoming out and pinching the skin with arm movements. For the legs, the quilted liners inside the cuisses and the mail chausses beneath them served as essential buffers. They prevented the solid steel plates from making direct contact with the skin, distributing the pressure and sliding across the surface of the padded fabric instead of the leg itself. The points system also played a role here. By keeping every piece of armor firmly anchored to the doublet, it minimized the independent shifting and sliding of plates that would cause the most severe chafing. The goal was to have the entire suit move as one unified layer over the padded undergarment, rather than having multiple layers of metal and cloth all moving against each other and the skin in a chaotic, abrasive mess. Yet, for all this clever design, some problems required a more primitive, hands-on solution. This is where a substance called tallow entered the knight's toolkit. Tallow is rendered animal fat, typically from sheep or cattle, and it was the medieval equivalent of a high-performance anti-chafing bomb. Before a long march or ahead of an expected battle, a knight or his squire would apply this greasy, pungent substance directly to the skin in the most vulnerable areas: the inner thighs, the armpits, the shoulders, and the back of the neck. The tallow worked by creating a slick, hydrophobic barrier. It reduced the coefficient of friction between the skin and the linen of the undertunic, allowing the fabric to slide more easily over the skin instead of dragging against it. This drastically reduced the formation of blisters and raw, weeping sores known as galling, which could become infected and incapacitate a warrior as surely as any enemy sword. The use of tallow was a tacit admission from even the most elite knight that technology could only do so much. Sometimes you needed to fight friction with fat. It was a gritty, unglamorous, but utterly essential part of preparing for war. A reminder that beneath the shining plate and heraldic glory, the medieval warrior's experience was intensely, and sometimes uncomfortably, human. This journey from the simple to the supremely complex didn't happen overnight. The elaborate system of the 15th century knight, with its arming doublet and strategic padding, was the culmination of centuries of painful, practical evolution, a direct response to the ever-changing face of warfare and the weapons designed to win it. To truly appreciate this sophisticated final product, we need to step back several hundred years to a very different kind of warrior, the Norman knight at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. If we could peel back the layers of a Norman knight's armor, the contrast would be stark. His primary defense was a long shirt of mail, a hauberk that might stretch to his knees, with integral sleeves and a coif that protected his head and neck. Underneath this heavy, flexible metal garment, there was very little in the way of specialized padding. His main layer would have been a sturdy, knee-length tunic made of wool or linen, worn over braies and simple leggings. While this tunic provided a basic buffer against the chafing of the mail, it was a far cry from the purpose-built gambeson. The concept of a dedicated, quilted under-armor garment was only just beginning to emerge in this period. Some wealthier knights might have worn a padded acqueton beneath their hauberks for extra comfort, but for many it was just the tunic and the mail. This meant that the full, crushing weight of the hauberk, which could be 30 pounds or more, rested directly on the knight's shoulders, a burden that would become excruciating over a long day of fighting. The protection was effective against slashing cuts, but the lack of substantial padding left the wearer highly vulnerable to the concussive force of blunt weapons like maces, or even a well-aimed sword pommel strike. The 12th and 13th centuries saw the first major revolution in both armor and what lay beneath it, driven largely by the increasing deadliness of crossbows and powerful longbows. Knights began adding more solid pieces of plate to their ensemble, starting with simple knee cops, polins, and eventually expanding to include shin guards, greaves, and early forms of breastplates. This shift from a purely flexible mail defense to a hybrid system of mail and plate fundamentally changed the requirements for the layers underneath. The hard, rigid plates couldn't simply rest on a wool tunic. They needed a stable, padded foundation to absorb shock and prevent them from being driven into the body. This was the period when the gambeson truly came into its own as an essential piece of military kit, evolving from an optional extra to a non-negotiable foundation layer. It became thicker, more consistently quilted, and widely adopted by knights and common foot soldiers alike. Its primary job was now clear: to cushion the body from the new reality of impacts against solid plate. The 14th century marked the true turning point, the great bridge between the age of mail and the age of plate. This era saw the rise of the iconic, transitional armor, where a knight might wear a coat of plates, a fabric garment with large steel plates riveted to the inside over a mail hauberk, with full plate arm and leg defenses. The under-armor system became a complex sandwich of layers. A knight would start with his linen undertunic and braies. Over that, he'd don his mail hauberk. Over the mail, he would wear a thick gambeson. And finally, over the gambeson, he would put on the coat of plates, or his emerging plate armor. This created an immensely protective, but also incredibly heavy and hot combination. The weight was still a significant issue, as the plate elements were often strapped directly to the limbs or suspended from a waist belt, lacking the integrated points system that would come later. This sets the stage for the 15th century pinnacle we've been discussing, the era of Gothic and Milanese plate armor. By this time, the mail hauberk had almost completely disappeared, rendered obsolete by the development of full-body plate that left no unprotected gaps. In its place came the specialized mail gussets and standard, small patches of mail sewn into the arming doublet to protect only the absolute essentials, like the armpits. The bulky, all-purpose gambeson was streamlined into the form-fitting, strategically padded arming doublet. This evolution was a direct response to the new reality of plate armor. The new plates were so expertly shaped to deflect blows, and so perfectly articulated, that they no longer needed a massive, mattress-like layer of padding to function. Instead, they required a smart, sleek foundation that could serve as an anchor point. The under-armor gear had evolved from being primarily about cushioning to being primarily about suspension and integration. The development of the points system on the doublet was the final masterful innovation that tied everything together, distributing weight with an efficiency the Norman knight at Hastings could never have imagined. Each step in this centuries-long journey was a direct answer to a new problem on the battlefield. A continuous dialogue between the weapon, the armor, and the clever, adaptable layers that made it all wearable. But this entire sophisticated system, from the linen undertunic to the arming doublet and its intricate points, came at a cost. The experience of being a knight, down to the very fabric against his skin, was profoundly divided by wealth and status. There was a vast, tangible difference between the under-armor kit of a wealthy duke and that of a poor, landless man-at-arms who fought for his daily bread. This divide wasn't just about comfort or luxury. It could genuinely impact a warrior's endurance, his health, and ultimately, his chances of survival on the battlefield. Let's start at the very foundation, the linen layer. For a lord or a wealthy knight, his undertunic and braies were a statement of his station. They would be crafted from the finest, softest, most tightly woven linen, often bleached to a pale, near white hue that signified wealth and cleanliness. The cut would be precise, tailored to his body to eliminate any excess fabric that could bunch and cause painful hot spots under the relentless pressure of his armor. These garments might even be lightly perfumed with lavender or other herbs, a small luxury to combat the inevitable odors of sweat, leather, and metal that would permeate his kit during a long campaign. For him, this first layer was about maintaining a semblance of civilized comfort amidst the grime of war. Contrast that with the reality for a poorer fighter. His linen underclothes were likely made from coarse, scratchy, loosely woven fabric, perhaps even a rough blend of hemp and low-grade flax. They were ill-fitting, possibly handed down or patched multiple times, and their primary color was the dull, earthy tone of undyed cloth. There were no perfumes here, only the practical, and often unsuccessful, hope that they would manage sweat and prevent the worst of the chafing. This fundamental disparity in comfort set the stage for the entire day. The wealthy knight started relatively at ease, while the poorer man was already negotiating with discomfort before a single piece of steel was even lifted. The gap widened dramatically when it came to the gambeson. A duke or a powerful baron could commission a masterpiece of the tailor's art. His gambeson would be constructed from the sturdiest canvas, stuffed with the highest quality, springy carded wool that offered superior shock absorption and retained its loftiness for years. The quilting would be incredibly dense and executed in beautiful, complex diamond patterns that locked the stuffing perfectly in place. It might even be lined with silk for an unparalleled feeling of smoothness against the undertunic. This wasn't just padding. It was a high-performance piece of defensive equipment in its own right, capable of turning a lethal blow into a severe bruise. For the man-at-arms, the gambeson was a piece of essential, often dilapidated, survival gear. His jacket was likely stuffed with whatever was cheapest and most readily available. Lumpy linen tow, chopped up scraps of old cloth, or even straw. The outer fabric might be a patchwork of repairs, and the quilting was sparse and simple, perhaps just vertical stripes that allowed the inferior stuffing to shift and settle unevenly over time. While it was still better than nothing, its protective qualities were vastly inferior. A blow that would leave the wealthy knight with a manageable ache could easily break the bone of the poorer soldier underneath his thin, compromised padding. His gambeson was a symbol of making do, a testament to the fact that any protection was better than none, even if it was a far cry from the ideal. This class divide reached its peak with the arming doublet. For the elite, this was a custom-fitted, technologically advanced foundation garment. Crafted by a specialist armorer tailor, it was a perfect marriage of form and function, with strategic padding only where it was needed and a flawless network of reinforced points, placed exactly for his unique suit of armor. It was a bespoke piece of kit, as personal as his sword. A poorer knight, if he could even afford one, would have to make do with a generic, off-the-rack version. It might be too loose in the torso, or too tight across the shoulders, causing the points to sit in the wrong places and making his armor hang awkwardly. The padding would be minimal and uniform, not strategic, leading to pressure points and reduced mobility. He might have to tie pieces of his older, outdated armor to this new doublet, creating a clumsy and inefficient hybrid system. Every aspect of his under-armor experience was a compromise, a constant reminder that his survival depended not just on his skill and courage, but on the depth of his purse. The battlefield, it turns out, was a level field only for the blows that landed upon it. The preparation to receive those blows was a matter of stark economic reality. This incredible layered system, developed over centuries, feels almost theoretical until we ask the most crucial question: what hard evidence do we actually have? The frustrating truth for historians and archaeologists is that the very nature of these materials works against their survival. Steel and iron can rust away to nothing, but under the right conditions, they can endure for centuries, leaving us with thousands of helmets, swords, and breastplates to study. Organic materials like linen, wool, and leather, however, face a much more relentless enemy: time itself. They biodegrade, rot, and return to the earth with astonishing speed, especially when buried. This means that finding actual physical remnants of a knight's undergarments, or a gambeson, is an exceptionally rare event, making each discovery a monumental occasion that can rewrite our understanding. The evidence we do have comes from a few precious sources. The first is the rare and miraculous survival of the actual garments themselves. There are a handful of nearly complete gambesons preserved in museums around the world, and each one is treated with the reverence of a holy relic. One of the most famous examples is the Charles de Blois gambeson, named for the Duke of Brittany, who died in 1364. This jacket is stunningly well preserved, allowing us to study its construction in intimate detail. It's made from over 20 layers of linen, quilted together in a precise diamond pattern. The sheer density of this garment is breathtaking. It's a testament to the fact that for many soldiers, this padded jacket was their armor. Examining it up close, you can see the thousands of tiny, meticulous stitches that hold its precious stuffing in place. A silent tribute to the anonymous tailor whose skill was meant to save a life. Another incredible survivor is the gambeson found with the remains of the German knight Christian von Opperstorff, who died in the mid-15th century. His was discovered still tucked inside his armor, a ghostly impression of the fabric, and padding that once cushioned his body. Finds like these are invaluable because they show us the real thing, not an artist's interpretation. We can analyze the thread count, the type of stitching, the materials used for the stuffing, and even the subtle tailoring techniques that allowed for mobility. They confirm what the written accounts and illustrations suggest, that these were complex, purpose-built pieces of equipment, not simple quilted vests. The second major source of evidence comes from a far more somber context: battle graves. The mass graves from the Battle of Wisby, fought on the Swedish island of Gotland in 1361, are perhaps the most informative archaeological site for medieval military historians. When the fallen soldiers were buried in their armor, the conditions were just right to preserve an incredible detail. The combination of limestone in the soil and the fact that the bodies were interred still wearing their equipment led to a phenomenon where the organic materials left behind a perfect stain, a dark shadow of their former presence, on the corroded metal plates they were touching. As archaeologists carefully excavated these remains, they found that the rusted mail shirts and coat of plates had preserved the exact outline of the gambesons worn beneath them. In some cases, they could even see the intricate quilting patterns, the diamonds and lozenges etched forever into the corrosion products of the steel. This allowed researchers to understand not just the cut and style of these padded garments, but also their thickness and how they were worn in relation to the metal armor. The Wisby finds provided irrefutable, physical proof that the gambeson was a standard piece of kit for soldiers of all types, from the wealthiest knight to the lowliest militiaman, and showed the precise way these layers interacted on the battlefield. The third line of evidence is more indirect, but no less important. Artistic representations and the rare survival of accessories, illuminated manuscripts, funeral brasses, and church effigies often show knights in meticulous detail. While we must be cautious, as art can sometimes be idealized or stylized, the consistency across many different sources from different regions gives us tremendous insight. We can see the telltale diamond quilting on the sleeves of an arming doublet, peeking out from under a vambrace, or the way a skirt of mail is depicted beneath a knight's surcoat. Furthermore, small metal and leather components sometimes survive where the fabric does not. The discovery of aglet tips, those metal ends on the points used to tie armor to the doublet in archaeological digs, confirms the existence of that sophisticated suspension system. Finding a rusted mail standard with fragments of linen or leather still trapped in its rings is another tiny window into the lost world of textile armor. Each of these fragments of evidence, the miraculously preserved jacket, the ghostly impression in a rusted breastplate, the metal aglet in the soil, is a piece of a giant puzzle. They force us to move beyond speculation and into the realm of confirmed fact. They tell us that the padding was indeed thick, the quilting was deliberately complex, and the entire system was worn by real people who depended on its clever design. Every archaeological find, no matter how small, adds another thread to our understanding, slowly weaving together the true picture of what a knight really wore under his armor. While surviving textiles are incredibly rare, we have another remarkable window into this hidden world, the art of the period itself. Medieval manuscripts, church effigies, and panel paintings are far more than just beautiful decorations. They are historical documents, often created by artists who would have seen knights and their gear with their own eyes. By learning to read these images with a detective's eye, we can uncover a wealth of detail about the under-armor system that the artists took for granted, but we so desperately want to understand. Take, for instance, the magnificent brass effigies found on tomb slabs in churches across Europe. To the casual observer, they are simply stylized representations of a knight in full armor. But if you look closer, you'll start to notice tiny, crucial details that the engraver included with meticulous care. Look at the area around the knees. Very often, you'll see a series of small, precise lines radiating from a central point on the polin, the knee cop. These aren't decorative flourishes. They are the engraved representation of the leather straps that secured the plate to the leg. Even more importantly, look along the edges of the armor, particularly at the hips and shoulders. You might see a series of small, dotted lines or dashes. These are the points, the laces that tied the entire leg harness or arm harness to the arming doublet underneath. The artist is showing us the very suspension system we've been discussing, proof that it was a standard and visible part of how a knight was equipped. The vibrant world of illuminated manuscripts is another treasure trove. Consider illustrations of famous battles, like those from the chronicles of Jean Froissart depicting the Battle of Agincourt. In these crowded, chaotic scenes, you'll often see soldiers who have shed their heavier plate pieces, perhaps due to heat or injury, fighting on in just their gambesons. And the artists almost always take the time to paint in the intricate quilting pattern, a dense field of diamonds or lozenges covering the torso and arms. This isn't artistic license. It's a faithful recording of what these garments looked like. The consistent depiction of this pattern across different artists and regions strongly suggests it was the universal method of construction, confirming its functional purpose in locking the stuffing in place. These illustrations show us the gambeson not as a vague concept, but as a real, widely used piece of equipment, its defining texture captured in ink and tempera. We can even find clues about the arming doublet itself. In some portraits and devotional paintings, a knight might be depicted not in battle, but in a moment of prayer or contemplation, often wearing what appears to be a stylish, tightly fitted jacket. Look at the sleeves of these garments. Frequently, they are shown with a series of vertical stripes or a subtle diamond pattern. And along the seams, you might see small, contrasting ties or dashes of color. This is likely the aristocratic, civilian version of the arming doublet, or perhaps even the doublet itself, being depicted as part of the subject's identity as a martial man. The visible points on the outside of the sleeves correspond exactly to where the points would be on the interior of a functional arming doublet, ready to have the vambraces and rebraces laced on. The art shows us that this foundational layer was so integral to a knight's life that it even crossed over into his formal portraiture. Of course, we must approach this evidence with a critical eye. Medieval art was often symbolic, and artists sometimes sacrificed accuracy for compositional balance or decorative effect. A painter might simplify the number of lames on a sabaton to make it easier to paint, or an illuminator might depict all gambesons with the same diamond pattern, simply because that's how he learned to draw them. However, the sheer volume of this art, and the remarkable consistency of these small, functional details across different mediums and centuries, gives us enormous confidence. When an English brass engraver, a French manuscript illuminator, and an Italian panel painter all show the same little laces at the shoulder or the same quilting on a jacket, they are almost certainly recording a common reality they all witnessed. This iconographic evidence bridges the gap between the silent artifacts in museums and the vibrant, noisy reality of the medieval world, allowing us to see these hidden layers not as abstract concepts, but as living, functional parts of a knight's daily existence. And all of this practical layering leads us directly to one of the most stubborn stereotypes about the Middle Ages: the idea of the perpetually filthy, unwashed knight, stewing in his own sweat and grime inside a sealed metal shell. While life in the 14th century was certainly less sanitized than our own, the reality of a knight's hygiene was far more thoughtful and deliberate than the popular myth suggests. In fact, the very design of his undergarments reveals a sophisticated understanding of cleanliness and body care, centered on a simple, brilliant principle: the washable layer. Remember that foundational linen undertunic and those braies, they weren't just for comfort. They were the medieval equivalent of moisture-wicking athletic wear, and crucially, they were designed to be laundered. Linen, unlike wool, could withstand vigorous washing, boiling, and bleaching without falling apart. This meant that while the outer layers of his kit, the gambeson, the arming doublet, and certainly the armor itself, were complex, time-consuming to maintain, and not washed after every use, The layer that was in direct contact with his skin could be regularly cleaned. A knight on campaign or returning from a tournament would shed his heavy steel and padded layers, but he could change into a fresh, clean linen tunic, instantly restoring a sense of hygiene and comfort. His soiled underclothes would be given to a squire or a camp follower to be scrubbed, boiled in a large kettle, and laid out to dry in the sun. This practice was not just for the wealthy. It was a standard of basic care that even poorer men-at-arms would strive for, because everyone understood that clean linens prevented the skin irritations and infections that could incapacitate a fighter as quickly as any enemy. This points to a broader, and often completely overlooked, medieval culture of bathing that flies in the face of the dirty Middle Ages cliché. Most towns of any size had public bathhouses, often referred to as stews, which were popular social hubs. For a small fee, a person could get a hot bath, a shave, and have their linens washed. For a knight, especially one from a noble household, bathing was a regular part of life. Castle accounts and household records from the period frequently list expenses for soap, perfumes, and the labor of those who heated water for baths. A wooden tub would be brought into a private chamber, filled with hot water, and often scented with herbs like lavender, rosemary, or rose petals. This wasn't a daily occurrence, but it was far more frequent than we might assume, perhaps weekly for the wealthy, or at the very least to mark the end of a campaign, a tournament, or before a major religious holiday. The perception of universal filth is largely a later invention, often exaggerated during the Reformation to criticize the perceived decadence of the medieval Catholic world, and later compounded by the horrors of the plague, which did understandably make people more fearful of public baths. The care of the armor itself also involved a form of hygiene. A knight's steel shell was never left to rust and molder. It was meticulously maintained by his squires, who would spend hours after a battle or a practice session scrubbing the plates with sand and vinegar to remove rust, polishing them with greased cloths to a brilliant shine, and oiling the leather straps to keep them supple. This wasn't just about vanity. A rusty, poorly maintained suit was a death trap, as corrosion could weaken the metal and jam the delicate articulation of the joints. So while a knight himself might not have showered in the modern sense every single day, he was far from the stinking, grime-encrusted figure of legend. He lived within a system that prioritized practical cleanliness, where the intimate layers were regularly washed. The body was bathed with reasonable frequency, and his most valuable equipment was kept in spotless, working order. The image of the knight in shining armor extends beyond the metal. It reflects a conscious and surprisingly modern appreciation for the connection between cleanliness, health, and readiness for the immense physical demands of his world. Now, to truly understand how all these layers work together in practice, there's nothing quite like seeing the process unfold in real time. Let's walk through the meticulous ritual of dressing a knight, not from a dusty manual, but as it's done today by dedicated reenactors and armorers who bring this history to life. This step-by-step process transforms our abstract knowledge into something tangible and truly impressive. It all begins with the soft layers, the medieval base. Our reenactor starts by stepping into his braies, those loose linen drawers, tying them securely at the waist with a long drawstring. Next come the chausses, the individual linen leggings. He carefully pulls each one up and, using thin leather laces, points them to the bottom edge of the braies. This simple act of tying his stockings to his underwear is the first crucial step in ensuring everything stays in place. A perfect example of medieval problem solving. Over this, he pulls on the long linen undertunic, the foundational garment that will manage moisture and prevent chafing all day. Even at this early stage, you can see how much thought went into comfort and functionality. The next layer is the heart of the entire system, the arming doublet. This isn't a simple pullover, it's a tailored garment that he laces up the front, fitting snugly to his torso. You can immediately see the strategic padding extra, quilting across the shoulders, under the arms, and around the ribs. But the most fascinating part is the network of leather laces that are sewn directly onto the fabric. These are the points, each one tipped with a metal aglet, and they're not for decoration. They are the anchor points for the entire suit of steel. He might then add the male standard, that small curtain of rings protecting his neck, which is sewn directly to the collar of the doublet. Now the arming begins in earnest, and it's a two-person job. An assistant, playing the role of the squire, kneels to start with the legs. The reenactor lifts his foot, and the squire straps on the sabaton, the intricate steel shoe that articulates with his foot's movement. Then comes the greave for the shin, buckling around the calf. But these pieces aren't just strapped to the leg. The squire takes the leather laces hanging from the bottom of the arming doublet and threads them through corresponding holes on the top of the greave and the bottom of the cuisse, the thigh plate, tying them off with a secure knot. This is the point system in action, suspending the entire weight of the leg armor from the hips, not the limbs. The process moves upward. The squire laces the vambraces to the points on the forearms, and the rerebraces to the points at the shoulders. With each piece added, you can see the reenactor's mobility being tested. He'll rotate his shoulders, bend his elbows, and flex his knees, ensuring every articulation moves smoothly and no strap is too tight. Finally, the larger pieces are added, the fold and tassets protecting the hips and thighs, followed by the breast and back plates, which are buckled together at the sides. The final touch is the helmet, carefully placed over the padded arming cap and secured with a chin strap. Seeing the final transformation is astonishing. The man who started in simple linen is now a figure of immense power and presence. But the real proof is in the movement. He draws a practice sword, shifts into a fighting stance, and moves. The armor doesn't clank and restrict. It moves with him, a symphony of softly rustling plates and leather. He can pivot, strike, and parry with a fluidity that utterly destroys the myth of the clumsy knight. This live demonstration makes it crystal clear. Every thread, every stitch, and every lace was engineered for one purpose: to create a mobile, protected, and ultimately lethal warrior. This brings us to a fascinating and often asked question. What about the women? Did legendary female warriors like Joan of Arc wear the exact same layers of linen and padded gambesons under their armor? The short answer is that the fundamental principles of protection would have been identical. But the practical execution might have been subtly, yet significantly, different. Joan herself was described by her contemporaries as being clad in a full suit of quality plate armor, commissioned for her by the French king. She would have faced the same brutal physics of combat as any male knight. A mace strike doesn't care about gender. Therefore, the non-negotiable need for shock-absorbing padding, moisture-wicking linen, and a secure foundation would have been exactly the same. Her survival depended on it. Where we enter the realm of historical speculation is in the tailoring. An arming doublet or gambeson designed for a male torso would have been uncomfortable and potentially unsafe for a woman to wear for extended periods. A garment cut for broad shoulders and a straight waist would have been constrictive across the chest and likely too loose in the waist, leading to inefficient weight distribution and dangerous shifting of the armor plates during movement. It is therefore almost certain that a high-profile figure like Joan, for whom custom armor was made, would have also had her undergarments tailored to her anatomy. This wouldn't have been about fashion. It was a matter of functionality and survival. A gambeson or doublet tailored for a woman would have likely featured darting or additional gussets under the arms, and through the torso to accommodate the bust, creating a closer, more secure fit that allowed the steel plates to sit properly without creating pressure points or gaps in protection. The frustrating truth, however, is that the evidence for this is virtually non-existent. Not a single example of a definitively female-specific gambeson or arming doublet has survived from the medieval period. The vast majority of artistic depictions show men, and the effigies that do exist of female warriors, like the famous one of Joan of Arc herself, are highly stylized and show her in a full suit of plate that obscures everything underneath. This lack of evidence is itself a historical statement, reflecting the simple fact that women who fought in full harness were the extreme exception, not the rule. Most textile armor was made by and for men, and the unique tailoring needs of female warriors were likely addressed on a very rare, case-by-case basis by their personal armorers. So while we can be confident that the function remained unchanged, the form was almost certainly adapted with the same practical ingenuity that defined all medieval armor, ensuring that every warrior, regardless of gender, was equipped to face the horrors of the battlefield. But for all its battlefield-ready design, the armor worn in a melee was a generalist's kit compared to the specialized tool developed for one of the most dangerous sports in history, the joust. When a knight entered the lists, he wasn't preparing for a chaotic exchange of blows. He was bracing for a single, catastrophic event, the full-force impact of a rival's lance, delivered at the combined speed of 2 charging warhorses. This unique threat demanded a radical rethinking of the under-armor system, transforming the already protective gambeson into something far more extreme. A veritable wearable mattress known as the stekzug or jousting gambeson. The defining principle here was sheer, uncompromising bulk. Where a battlefield gambeson might be a manageable inch or 2 thick, a high-quality jousting gambeson could be a staggering 4 to 5 inches of densely packed, quilted material. Imagine wearing the equivalent of a modern mattress topper under your steel shell. That's the level of protection we're talking about. This immense thickness wasn't uniform, however. The padding was strategically reinforced in the areas most likely to receive a direct hit. The entire left side of the torso and shoulder, the side presented to an opponent during a pass, would be massively built up. The center of the chest, a prime target for a well-aimed lance point, would also feature extra layers of stuffing. This wasn't about stopping a blade. It was about absorbing and dispersing an amount of kinetic energy that could easily shatter bones and cause fatal internal injuries, even if the lance itself did not penetrate the plate. The construction of these specialized garments was a marvel of defensive tailoring. They were often made from dozens of layers of linen or fustian, quilted together with such intensely close stitching that the surface resembled a tough, fibrous wood grain. The filling was no longer just wool or cloth scraps. Armorers used the most resilient materials available. Horsehair was the premium choice for the elite, prized for its incredible springiness and ability to retain its shape after a massive impact. When a lance struck, the horsehair stuffing would compress dramatically, absorbing the energy and then spring back, ready for the next pass. For others, layers of raw, unprocessed wool felted together provided a cheaper but still highly effective alternative. The goal was to create a cushion so effective that the knight inside would feel only a profound, jarring shove rather than a bone-crushing strike. This incredible bulk naturally came with significant trade-offs. Mobility was almost entirely sacrificed for the sake of protection. A knight wearing this kind of padding, combined with the heavier, more rigid specialized jousting armor, could barely move his arms to the sides. His entire world narrowed to the tunnel vision of the lance rest, focused solely on guiding his own weapon and bracing for impact. The heat generated inside this cocoon of fabric and steel would have been immense, making a pass down the lists an act of endurance measured in seconds rather than minutes. This was not the armor of a campaign. It was a single-purpose safety suit for the most violent of sporting events, a testament to the fact that when the goal was to knock a man off his horse at full gallop, no amount of padding was considered excessive. While the European knight was perfecting his layered system of linen and padded wool on the other side of the world, the Japanese samurai was engaged in a remarkably similar pursuit of comfort and protection under his own iconic armor. The samurai's yoroi, that beautiful and fearsome lamellar armor made from hundreds of small iron and leather scales laced together, presented many of the same challenges as a full suit of plate mail. It was heavy, rigid, and could chafe terribly without the right foundation. And just like his European counterpart, the samurai's solution began with cloth. The foundational layer for a samurai was the shitogi, a loose-fitting, straight-sleeved robe typically made from linen or hemp. This garment served the exact same essential purpose as the European knight's linen undertunic: moisture management. It was designed to be breathable, wicking sweat away from the body during the intense physical exertion of battle, or the long, humid marches of a Japanese summer. Beneath the shitogi, a warrior would wear a loincloth, or fundoshi, providing a basic yet practical layer of personal hygiene. For the legs, the samurai wore hakama, those wide, pleated trousers that are so iconic today. While the formal hakama of later periods was stiff, the versions worn under armor were more practical, offering tremendous freedom of movement for mounting a horse, drawing a bow, or assuming a deep, stable fighting stance. The loose cut of both the shitogi and hakama prevented the hard edges of the armor from pressing directly against the skin, creating that all-important airy buffer zone that was vital for ventilation and preventing chafing. But the most direct parallel to the European gambeson is found in the ukibukuro, or floating bag. This was a padded robe worn over the shitogi and under the main armor. Crafted from layers of cotton or linen and stuffed with raw silk wadding, it was quilted in a distinctive pattern to keep the stuffing evenly distributed. This garment was absolutely critical for shock absorption. The yoroi armor, while brilliant at deflecting slashing cuts from a katana, was less effective at dispersing the concussive force of a heavy impact, like the strike of a kanobo war club or a well-placed arrow. The thick, padded ukibukuro acted as a cushion, soaking up that energy and preventing it from transferring directly to the samurai's body. In colder months or for added protection, a warrior might even wear a tatami-do, a portable folding armor that incorporated padded cloth with small iron plates sewn directly into it, functioning as a gambeson and coat of plates all in one. This fascinating convergence of design across two completely isolated cultures isn't a coincidence. It's a powerful example of parallel evolution, solving universal problems. Both knight and samurai faced the same brutal realities of metallurgy and human biomechanics. They both needed to manage heat and moisture. They both needed to mitigate the punishing shock of battlefield impacts. And they both needed to prevent their own defensive gear from incapacitating them through sheer discomfort. The solutions they independently arrived at: a breathable linen underlayer, loose-legged trousers for mobility, and a thick, quilted garment for padding, are nearly identical in function. It reveals a universal truth about warfare. The best technology is often that which addresses the most human needs, ensuring the warrior inside the armor remains as protected from his own gear as he is from his enemy's weapons. This meticulous historical reconstruction isn't just for show. It's put to the ultimate test by a thriving global community of historical reenactors and HEMA practitioners. That's historical European martial arts. These modern warriors don't just study ancient combat manuals. They physically step into the shoes of a medieval knight, donning full reproductions of period-accurate armor to spar, compete, and train. And just like their historical counterparts, they face the same fundamental question. What do you wear under all that steel to survive a full day of combat in the 21st century? For a significant portion of this community, the answer is unwavering authenticity. They commit to using only the materials that would have been available 700 years ago. This means their first layer is a hand-stitched linen undertunic and braies, often sourced from specialty vendors who use historically accurate weaving techniques. Their gambeson or arming doublet is the centerpiece of their kit, custom made to their measurements and stuffed with carded wool or even horsehair, quilted in precise period patterns. They argue that you cannot truly understand the experience, the limitations, and the brilliance of medieval armor without also embracing the layers that made it functional. Wearing modern fabrics under a hand-forged suit of plate, they contend, creates a false experience. It divorces the wearer from the very realities of moisture management, weight distribution, and heat retention that define the knight's reality. For them, the slight itch of the wool stuffing, or the way a linen tunic feels after an hour of sweating, is all part of the historical record, a tactile connection to the past that no textbook can provide. Yet, for other practitioners, particularly those engaged in the high-intensity world of competitive HEMA, practicality and safety sometimes take precedence over strict historical accuracy. While they might wear a beautifully crafted wool or horse, hair-stuffed gambeson for a demonstration or a photo shoot, their weekly training rig might look quite different underneath. In these demanding sessions, where the goal is to practice technique and build stamina without suffering from heat exhaustion, many incorporate modern technical fabrics. Moisture-wicking base layers made from polyester or elastane blends are a common sight under training gambesons. These modern materials are engineered to pull sweat away from the body with far greater efficiency than linen, helping to regulate core temperature and prevent the kind of dehydration that can lead to cramps and heat stroke during a long practice. This choice is less about rejecting history and more about enabling more frequent, safer, and more effective training, allowing a fighter to get in more repetitions without sacrificing their health to absolute authenticity. This divergence in approach has sparked a fascinating and ongoing debate within the community, a conversation that mirrors larger discussions about how we interact with history. Though authenticity first, camp views any modern material as a compromise that corrupts the experimental archaeological process. They ask, how can we truly test the efficacy of historical armor if we change one of its most critical components? If a modern wicking layer keeps you cooler and drier, it fundamentally alters your physical experience and endurance, potentially leading to flawed conclusions about how long a medieval knight could actually fight. On the other side, the practicality advocates argue that their primary goal is to preserve the martial art itself, and that sometimes requires modern solutions to ensure safety and consistency in training. They point out that few modern fighters have a squire to help them in and out of their gear, or the luxury of time to properly launder and dry heavy linen layers between daily practices. A modern base layer is durable, quick drying, and helps prevent skin infections in a shared gym environment. For them, the armor itself is the focus of historical study, while the base layer is a matter of personal equipment hygiene and performance. What's remarkable is that this debate isn't hostile. It's a dialogue driven by a shared passion. Both sides are contributing valuable data. The authenticity-focused reenactors provide incredible insights into the lived experience and the long-term wearability of historical systems, often documenting the break-in period of a new gambeson or how different stuffing materials perform over time. The practicality-focused hammer fighters, by contrast, offer robust stress testing of the armor's defensive capabilities and articulation under high-intensity conditions. Together, they are building a more complete and nuanced understanding of medieval warfare than either approach could achieve alone, proving that the question of what to wear under armor is as relevant and contested today as it ever was. So when we strip away the gleaming steel and look past the legendary figure, we find something far more relatable. A person. A human being who got hot, who chafed, who sweat, and who needed to move with agility and confidence in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The suit of plate armor wasn't a robotic shell that erased the man inside. It was an extension of him, and its legendary effectiveness depended entirely on the sophisticated, often overlooked, layers of cloth and padding that made it wearable. This hidden system was a true masterpiece of medieval textile engineering, a triumph of practicality born from centuries of hard-won experience on the battlefield. It represents the ultimate fusion of brute force and brilliant design, where the relentless power of hammered steel was perfectly balanced by the clever, comfortable subtlety of quilted fabric and tied laces. Every thread, every stitch, and every choice of material served a purpose, transforming an assemblage of metal plates from a mobile prison into a second skin. This incredible synergy between hard and soft, metal and cloth, is what turned a knight into the formidable warrior of history and legend. It reminds us that behind every great technological achievement, whether 700 years ago or today, lies a deeply human need for comfort, efficiency, and the simple, profound desire to not just survive an ordeal, but to master it. And so there you have it, the surprisingly sophisticated, deeply human truth of what really lay beneath all that shining steel. From the simple linen that touched their skin to the ingeniously quilted layers that saved their lives, every thread tells a story of innovation born from necessity. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the very fabric of history. It's been an absolute pleasure to unravel this mystery with you. Now I have to ask, what part of a knight's hidden kit surprised you the most? Was it the fact they tied their socks to their underwear, or the clever point system that turned a suit of armor into a wearable exoskeleton? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one and love hearing what captures your imagination. If you enjoyed solving this historical mystery with me, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss our next adventure. We're always digging into the past to uncover the gritty, real, and fascinating stories you won't find in the history books. And speaking of gritty realities, have you ever wondered what medieval castles really smelled like? It's a question that's far more complex and surprising than you might think. And it's the subject of our very next video. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for that one. Until next time, thanks for watching.